What happens when a man is disrespected, and the world has no idea who he really is? Today, you're about to witness the story of Ibrahim Traoré, one of Africa's most powerful presidents, facing humiliation in the skies, and the shocking way he turned it all around. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible stories that reveal the strength and resilience of leaders who defy expectations. The cabin lights flickered faintly against the dark belly of the night sky. Outside the windows, clouds tore open with every strike of lightning, painting nervous silhouettes across the faces of weary passengers. The engines groaned, a hollow reminder of how fragile humanity's inventions are when swallowed by the heavens. In seat 27A sat a man who drew no attention. His clothes were simple, his posture still, his eyes lost in silence. To the world around him, he was just another traveler. But his silence carried the weight of storms. A flight attendant, weary from long hours and sharpened by arrogance, stopped beside him. She looked him over, her eyes narrowing with the dismissive sharpness of someone used to ranking human worth at a glance. The tray she handed him was cold, the words she spoke colder. Her tone dripped with disdain, as if she had decided before meeting him that this man was less. Some passengers chuckled softly, others looked away, pretending not to notice. Humiliation hung in the air, invisible yet suffocating. He did not answer. He simply lowered his gaze and let the insult pass. To anyone else, it might have seemed weakness, a man too afraid to speak. But silence, when chosen, is never weakness. It is a weapon sharpened by patience. The plane trembled again, turbulence rocking it like a ship caught between waves. The laughter that had moments ago mocked him was swallowed in unease. Yet the flight attendant continued her disdain, tapping his arm with unnecessary force, correcting his every small move, her voice carrying louder than the engines themselves. She did not know who he was. She could not imagine the gravity of the man before her. Far below them, Africa stretched wide and restless in the darkness. Cities flickered with dim lights, villages lay in hunger's shadow, and whispers of rebellion crawled across borders. The man in seat 27A carried those whispers in his chest, though none around him would have believed it. They saw only an ordinary passenger. They were blind to the weight of his silence, blind to the storm he represented. And yet, storms cannot be ignored forever. What he did next would ripple across continents, and the world would never again look at him the same. Long before the flight attendant's sneer, before the cabin air thickened with arrogance, Ibrahim Traoré had already walked through fire. He was not born into palaces or privilege. His childhood was marked by scarcity, by the sound of empty pots echoing in the dark corners of homes where mothers pretended food was still coming. He grew up in a land where hunger was more familiar than comfort, where children memorized the language of survival before they could write their own names. Burkina Faso was a country stitched together with pain and resilience. Its earth was rich with gold, yet its people scraped by with dust. Foreign hands mined its soil, foreign banks dictated its economy, and foreign powers whispered threats behind polished doors. Generations had endured this suffocation, and from that silence, legends were born. Thomas Sankara had once stood tall against the tide, his words like fire against oppression. But fire too can be extinguished, and his assassination cast a shadow that still lingered decades later. In that shadow, Ibrahim emerged. He was a soldier first, not for glory but for survival. His comrades saw in him something rare, a quiet defiance, a refusal to bow, a loyalty to the soil under his boots rather than the foreign orders above his head. He did not dress like a ruler, nor speak like one. His words were heavy but few, and when he rose to power, it was not on the shoulders of ambition, but on the desperation of a nation crying for dignity. Yet power is never truly free. With leadership came betrayal. The same foreign powers that drained his country's veins demanded more. They wanted gold in exchange for chains, compliance in exchange for peace. Meetings in glittering halls became battlegrounds where suits smiled with daggers behind their teeth. He resisted. Every refusal carved his name deeper into their list of enemies. So when he boarded that flight, he carried no entourage, no symbol of rank or protection. He wore humility like armor, blending into the crowd of weary travelers. He wanted to remind himself, perhaps, what it was to be unseen. Or maybe he wanted to test the world, to see how it treated a man stripped of titles. The irony was cruel. Even in the skies above Africa, disrespect found him. The woman who dismissed him could not know the weight of history that sat in that narrow seat. She could not know that her small cruelty mirrored centuries of greater ones, that her arrogance echoed the disdain of empires. And as the plane cut through the clouds, passengers around him whispered of politics and power, never realizing that the very man who carried their continent's future sat among them in silence. The hum of the engines was steady, but underneath it, another hum pulsed, the tension of secrets unspoken, identities concealed, and a storm waiting to break. The hours dragged on inside the cabin, but the humiliation did not end. Every time the flight attendant passed his row, her disdain sharpened. A tray of food delivered late and cold. A curt order to adjust his seat when others reclined without notice. A deliberate ignorance of his requests, as if he were invisible in her world of hierarchies. Passengers nearby began to notice, but silence reigned. Some smirked at the quiet humiliation, others looked away, unwilling to interfere. His stillness was mistaken for weakness, but weakness was never part of him. He had survived betrayals far worse than the casual cruelty of strangers. He had seen men smile while signing contracts that robbed his country of its future. He had sat in rooms where promises of aid carried hidden daggers, and where every handshake was the beginning of another chain. Compared to that, her insults were dust, yet the symbolism was inescapable. Here, in this pressurized capsule suspended between earth and sky, the drama of an entire continent was replaying itself. And then, there were the others. Not the laughing passengers or the weary mothers holding restless children, but those who sat too still. Two men in tailored suits, speaking to no one, watching everything. A woman near the back of the cabin who scribbled endlessly in a small notebook, her eyes occasionally lifting to scan the rows. The attendant's cruelty no longer seemed random. Her gaze, sharp and assessing, lingered too long on him. What began as mere arrogance now felt like something heavier, something deliberate. The turbulence returned, stronger this time. Luggage rattled overhead, cups spilled, children cried. In the chaos, one of the suited men leaned forward ever so slightly, his eyes fixed on Ibrahim with unnerving intent. The plane was not just a vessel of travel anymore. It had become a stage, each player assigned a role in a script unseen by most. Outside, the storm churned, lightning streaking the sky in violent arcs. Inside, another storm was forming. His silence, once overlooked, now drew attention. Those who had mocked him began to wonder. Those who had ignored him began to feel uneasy. Still, he sat unmoved, his hands folded, his eyes cast toward the darkened window where his own reflection stared back at him. To anyone else, he was only a man enduring humiliation. But beneath that quiet exterior was a weight that no one in that cabin could yet comprehend. He had faced generals who plotted in secret, foreign bankers who demanded his nation's submission, allies who betrayed him in shadows. And now, 30,000 feet above the earth, he faced something different, but no less dangerous, the slow tightening of an invisible noose. The attendant's whispers grew hushed but sharp. The suited men adjusted their ties and glanced toward the cockpit. The scribbling woman closed her notebook with care, as if waiting for a signal. Passengers shifted uneasily, sensing tension they could not name. The air was no longer heavy with arrogance alone, it was thick with intent, and still he remained silent, because silence, when chosen, is not surrender. It is preparation. The cabin had grown restless. The turbulence that had once shaken only trays and teacups now seemed to have crept into every heart on board. Passengers shifted nervously, glancing at one another, whispering under their breath. Something was wrong. It was not only the storm outside, it was the storm building inside. The flight attendant's mask of professionalism cracked further with each passing minute. Her tone grew sharper, her movements more aggressive. She placed trays down with the slam of quiet hostility, corrected him with unnecessary force, as if determined to remind him of his place. She could not know that he had once stood in rooms where presidents lowered their voices in his presence. She could not know that her scorn was not simply hers. It carried the echo of centuries of dismissal that Africa itself had endured. And then came the moment. The attendant leaned close, her voice dripping with condescension, demanding he rise from his seat so she could make room for more important passengers. Gasps rippled quietly through the cabin. A few laughed nervously, others lowered their heads in shame, unwilling to intervene. She waited for his protest, for his anger, for the explosion she thought she could control. But he gave her nothing. Only silence. His stillness unnerved her. It unnerved everyone. In that silence, something shifted. The passengers who had mocked him began to wonder, who was this man, who absorbed humiliation with such dignity? Why did his quiet gaze unsettle them more than any raised voice could have? The two suited men rose from their seats. They moved with the calm precision of those who believed they owned the moment. Their eyes, sharp and calculating, locked on him. The scribbling woman near the back slipped her notebook into her bag, her expression unreadable. The atmosphere thickened. Even the children who had been crying moments earlier fell silent, as if they too sensed the gravity that was about to unfold. The attendant stepped back as the suited men closed in. Their words were quiet, measured, but their intent carried like thunder through the cabin. They spoke of compliance, of authority, of rules that must be obeyed. They leaned into him as though addressing a prisoner, not a leader, and finally he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stood. His figure was not imposing in size, but in presence. The murmurs in the cabin ceased. Every eye turned to him. The storm outside illuminated his profile in flashes of white fire against the windows, a figure carved in resilience and silence. He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, not for words, but for the simplest of objects, a folded document, stamped and sealed, bearing a crest recognized by governments across the world. He placed it on the attendant's tray with calm precision. The suited men froze. The attendant's face drained of color. Passengers craned their necks to see, to understand, to grasp what had shifted in an instant, because in that moment, the ordinary traveler ceased to exist. The truth uncoiled itself in the air like lightning. The man they had mocked, humiliated, diminished, was none other than a sitting head of state. Not just any leader, but one who had become a symbol of defiance against global powers. Ibrahim Traoré. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Every insult, every smirk, every slight that had been directed toward him now echoed back like accusations against those who delivered them. The flight attendant stumbled for words, her arrogance collapsing into stammering apologies. The suited men, once predators, now looked like prey, but Ibrahim did not gloat. He did not raise his voice, did not demand retribution. His silence remained unbroken, but it was no longer the silence of patience. It was the silence of revelation, a silence so loud it drowned the engines, a silence that forced every soul aboard to confront what they had done, what they had believed, what they had assumed about the man who had sat among them unseen. And in that silence, dignity became defiance. The cabin had been transformed. No longer a space of humiliation, it had become a courtroom. And in that courtroom, every passenger was a witness. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, ashamed of their complicity. Others sat rigid, unable to meet his gaze. A few perhaps felt a flicker of awe, as though they had glimpsed something holy. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the true storm had already broken. The plane touched down with a muted thud, the storm outside finally yielding to the calm of night. Inside, the cabin had transformed. The same passengers who had laughed at him, sneered at him, and dismissed him as ordinary, now carried the weight of their ignorance. Eyes that had once judged now traced him with quiet reverence. The flight attendant, once sharp and unyielding, looked down at her hands, flushed with shame, as if she had been caught unprepared in history itself. Ibrahim did not raise his voice, did not demand apologies, did not claim vengeance. He walked down the aisle with a quiet authority, each step deliberate, measured, echoing the unspoken command of a man who had endured far more than any insult from a stranger. The suited men followed him with rigid faces, the power they had tried to wield over him rendered meaningless by a single, calm revelation of identity. Outside, the tarmac was quiet. Illuminated by the cold gleam of runway lights, a few passengers lingered, hesitant, their gazes following him as though drawn by gravity. And in that hesitation, in that stunned silence, something shifted. Humiliation had been met with dignity, arrogance had been answered with grace, disrespect had been transformed into a lesson. News would travel quickly. The story of the quiet passenger who had endured mockery in the skies and revealed himself only with calm certainty spread across continents. By morning, it was not the flight attendant's moment of authority anyone remembered, nor the whispers of the suited men. It was his quiet defiance, his unwavering composure, the reminder that a single man armed with integrity and courage could challenge assumptions and shatter misconceptions. Back in Africa, ordinary people heard the story and felt a spark. Mothers in villages, who had long suffered silently, remembered that dignity could not be stolen. Children who had watched their elders bow too often learned that strength could be quiet, invisible, but unyielding. Soldiers who had doubted their leaders saw that true power was not in intimidation or force, but in restraint and resolve. Across the continent, something unspoken stirred. Pride, resilience, the quiet rise of recognition that their leaders, their champions, were among them, watching, enduring, defending. And Ibrahim? He disappeared into the night, blending once again with anonymity, leaving the world to ponder what had just transpired. No celebrations, no fanfare, only the quiet satisfaction of a task done, of lessons delivered, of respect reclaimed. The flight attendant returned to her duties, transformed by the encounter, aware that the air she had filled with arrogance had been reclaimed by history. The suited men departed, humbled, reminded that power is meaningless when it is misapplied. And the passengers, for the first time, recognized the weight of their assumptions, the fragility of prejudice, and the quiet potency of integrity. From one small plane in the sky, a message traveled farther than any speech, any decree, any headline. The dignity of a man can illuminate the strength of a people. The world watched, remembered, and could no longer ignore that beneath the ordinary appearance of one. The extraordinary had always been present, and as Ibrahim Traoré vanished into the night, the question lingered, unspoken but heavy in the hearts of all who had witnessed it. If one man's silence could shift the course of a cabin, what could the courage of an entire continent do?